We all had that phase in middle school where we tried to identify with a certain aesthetic, but could only half commit and ended up looking like a complete mess that wasn't really anything at all, yet was clearly trying to be too much. Right? Maybe not everyone went through that, but I'm sure we can all at least tangentially relate to having some sort of identity crisis. I hope. Embarrassing personal experiences aside, Pokemon seems to be experiencing the same kind of thing this hardware generation. Pokemon has always been a lot of things. A game series, a card game, an anime, a broad suite of collectible items and toys, etc. Now, in recent years, it seems like the games themselves have been trying to be a lot of things. Since Sun and Moon, I've had the impression that Gamefreak isn't really sure what direction to take the series. Sun and Moon got rid of gyms in an attempt to differentiate them from numerous previous generations, though this ended up being a very shallow and meaningless change as the trial system was nearly identical. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon were poised to fill a similar role to Black and White 2, but ended up not being really substantially different in terms of story, and then the Let's Go games were a very casual set of remakes that admittedly did try some substantial new things. Initial reception was critical, and ultimately I think the games are just okay, but I admire the attempt to differentiate them from the mainline games. Sword and Shield were certainly underbaked, but I think they are really underappreciated as a step forward for the franchise, however small it was. Adopting the overworld encounter system from Let's Go was a major change for the mainline games, and bringing them over to the mainline games showed that these kind of side projects meant something. The wild areas, while again severely lacking in the face of their potential, at least showed a willingness to try something new. And using DLC rather than attempting a third version or a pair of sequels was also a phenomenal change for the series. I always hated the third entry sequel pattern, and I think DLC is a far better way of adding more interesting new content without requiring players to replay the entire game. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl forsakes all of these new features and really only upgrades the game by retaining some quality of life improvements and speeding up the pace of the game. All of this being said, there is a common theme here. That being that each new entry takes a very tiny step towards trying something new. And when looked at all together, these changes end up being somewhat significant. Even to the point where the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes, going back to fully random encounters, was really frustrating to me. But from game to game, these changes are very small. As previously mentioned, the casual-focused Let's Go games are actually substantially different from the mainline, foregoing random encounters entirely, and replacing wild battles with a Pokemon Go-esque catching mechanic that quickens the overall pace of the game and incentivizes players to actually catch more Pokemon. Now, some of the more under-the-hood elements of battles were also removed, making the games very approachable to beginners and casuals, but not at all accommodating to more competitive fans. And personally, I don't mind these changes, but they certainly do limit the appeal for the larger audience. These games have the strongest sense of identity or purpose pre-Arceus, but I simply don't think it's filling a need that the mainline games don't. Pokemon is already really easy to pick up and understand, and abilities and IVs and other mechanics that were removed from Let's Go aren't by any means necessary to the core experience and can easily be ignored. Moving on to Sword and Shield in 2019, these entries are, as of yet, the only brand new generation the Switch has seen. And yet, these games are the most confused of the Switch entries. Certain areas of the game have seen a significant boost in production quality over prior entries. These games also get a lot of hate for cutting back the Pokédex and replacing Mega Evolution with Dynamax. For some reason, Gamefreak isn't willing to stick to Mega Evolutions, so they've tried a new core gimmick each generation since, and nothing really sticks. This just emphasizes that Gamefreak doesn't really know how to innovate, prioritizing new mechanics instead of refining ones that make the game better and that people enjoy. This is reminiscent of a design philosophy at Nintendo proper that being new is more valuable than being refined or good, even when that means abandoning well-loved features, franchises, etc. Ironically, however, every Pokemon game feels anything but new compared to the last. Finally, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are interesting in that they seem to have a very clear identity of what they are in and of themselves as very faithful remakes, but they seem a little bit confused in the larger context of the entire franchise. Previously, remakes have taken an older generation of games and entirely remade them to fit the modern standards of the series. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl opt to be incredibly faithful to the originals to a point where even content from Pokemon Platinum is largely excluded, and there is certainly room for debate that Platinum remains the best version. Overworld encounters do not make their way over from the new games, and very little new is added. The Grand Underground is a substantial chunk of new content for these remakes, but regardless, the games do feel dated on arrival. It's also very important to note that these remakes were outsourced to ILCA, the team responsible for Pokemon Home. And while it likely depends on their commercial success, the implication seems to be that remakes will be handled externally from now on, allowing Gamefreak to focus on brand new entries. All of this is to say that even these incredibly conservative remakes are experimental. Gamefreak and the Pokemon Company are giving ILCA a chance to prove themselves, somewhat reminiscent of Mercury's Steam in their Metroid 2 remake. The point being that while at the moment these games might seem a little confused, it's probably Gamefreak charting a course for the future, laying out the groundwork for the franchise's new identity going forward. Finally, we arrive at Legends Arceus, which simultaneously feels like Gamefreak saying they have a vision for the future, while also still entirely feeling like an experiment that could lead to nothing. Gamefreak has essentially taken the two biggest changes from Let's Go and Sword and Shield and expanded them into an entire game. Pokemon now exclusively roam the overworld, which is a large, open, and empty space, like the wild areas from Sword and Shield. Prior to release, I was a little skeptical on how much of a departure the game would actually be. I was worried that noble Pokemon would just replace gyms and the overall game structure would feel too familiar, but just in a different setting that doesn't really change the way the games are played. Luckily, this was not the case at all, and it ended up being really exciting not knowing exactly what I'd be doing next for once, and the game was really fun. The core of the Pokemon gameplay is all still here. Battling and catching Pokemon is still the very heart of the gameplay, but the entire process has been streamlined and made significantly less tedious, allowing it all to be genuinely fun and refreshing. And it's evident that the team has rethought the game from the ground up. Controlling the throw of each Pokeball connects the player to the game in a way that has been missing from the franchise for decades. And just like Let's Go, having catching being a more streamlined mechanic makes it really enticing for the player to actually collect all the different Pokemon. So Gamefreak has clearly demonstrated that they are willing and wanting to break from the core tradition in meaningful ways, and in many ways this entry feels like a culmination of the Switch era of experimentation. While it is certainly not perfect, the game actually commits to being different, having been rethought from the ground up, unlike Sword and Shield or Sun and Moon. And it holds its own distinct identity, carving out a place of its own both in the long lineage of Pokemon games and as a worthwhile addition to the Switch's library. Unfortunately, this alone does not completely solve the identity crisis. For all the ambition Legends Arceus embodies, it still feels a little confused. The game is being treated as more than a spin-off, but less than a main entry. Let's Go was treated similarly, although it ultimately landed much closer to main series than not, due to them being paired remakes of main series titles in the typical holiday slot. Yet, I think these games serve similar purposes, to try out new mechanics before including them in the main series. Let's Go and Legends have both set themselves up to be potentially concurrent side series to the main games and more experimental versions of a tried and true formula, which ultimately makes changes very incremental when they are spread across 3 separate styles of entry. All of this is to say that Gamefreak just doesn't know exactly how to handle change and progression. They want to satisfy longtime fans, competitive players, and casuals alike, so they're afraid to tamper with the formula too much from generation to generation. But it's clear that the team has a desire to do something new. God, after 25 years of making the same damn game, who wouldn't? At the end of the day, all of this indicates that this is still very much an experiment for Gamefreak. The team has not fully committed to making this the future, but rather has presented a possibility. And as overdone as the cliche is, it's helpful to compare it to Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild, beyond being a fantastic game that I hope to talk about at length soon, was a game that stood for a lot. It was a commitment from the team to upset tradition and present something entirely new. And not just to do it once and change their minds to the old style again, but to change what the perception of the Zelda series could be forever. Legends Arceus feels more like the team saying, well, we understand that some people are tired of the traditional Pokemon experience, so here's a different approach that we're trying out, but if it doesn't work, we're gonna pretend like it never existed. It just doesn't feel like a ride or die situation, and that's because it isn't. Pokemon games continue to sell like crazy no matter how much controversy they're mired in. Ultimately, what I mean to say is that Arceus does not definitively solve the identity crisis, but I'm optimistic that it will stand as a turning point. Fortunately, critical and commercial reception for the game has been incredibly strong, and I have seen a genuinely shocking lack of negativity post-launch. For all of the problems the game has, everyone seems to be enjoying it. Hopefully, Gamefreak is receptive to this and starts making this the norm, building on what makes the game great and improving where it falters. However, there is a very real risk that Generation 9 is already in development and is not built to accommodate any of these changes to the gameplay, or that Gamefreak simply isn't willing to abandon the old formula and the Legends sub-series will be simply that, a sub-series. Okay, so what? So far I've just dumped a bunch of info on the last 4 years of Pokemon, so what does any of it mean? To recap, Gamefreak is creatively spread thin, cautiously tweaking the gameplay formula over separate entries because they just can't figure out what they want mainline Pokemon to be. Legends Arceus has come around, obviously trying to make big changes to the formula, but is absolutely still an experimental endeavor. But it may very well serve as the solution for the identity crisis. The way I see it, there are two possible scenarios going forward. Scenario 1 is Gamefreak being unwilling to change the main series or being unable to for whatever reasons, and the main games continue to slowly iterate over the years across various types of entry, and the Legends games are afforded less time and less money, and ultimately suffer the same fate of hardly ever being improved, and the series will feel just as lost as ever. Scenario 2 is if they take the ideas in Arceus and run with them. Generation 9 is another collection of open maps, but now we get to discover new Pokemon and explore a new region, and the series finds new life as a healthy amount of development resources are poured into making this style of gameplay more refined, adding new layers and elements. And even if the core gym setup stays the same and linear routes still connect the map, carrying over the catching mechanics and the player freedom is essential for the franchise to stay fresh. Though, at the end of the day, the actual gameplay elements that carry over to the next game are not nearly as important as the design philosophies from this game. While I know I and many others would enjoy games that iterate off this style for a few years, the risk then becomes this style of gameplay becoming the new norm and is ever so slowly iterated on for the next decade, and the whole cycle just repeats itself. The solution to the identity crisis lies in having each sub-series of Pokemon fill its specific role, covering all the bases, while ensuring that each brand new entry is treated with the same commitment to breaking convention as Arceus. Not to say that the games shouldn't refine and iterate on this formula for a while, but new games need to have substantial changes that alter the overall experience in meaningful ways in order for the franchise to feel fresh. Unfortunately, the Switch era just happens to be the painful growing period that Pokemon needs to become something truly revolutionary again. Just like our time in middle school, we may not look back on it fondly, and it may have been very embarrassing and very ugly, but it ultimately made us who we are today. And I can only hope this struggle is not for nothing in the case of Pokemon.